All right, so we are gathered here today because we've just announced the launch of Ledger Stax, which is the next step in Ledger's hardware journey. I think it's really important to actually discuss this crypto experience that Ledger Stax brings and the evolution that it comes with from Ledger. But I want to do that by starting actually with you. We happen to be two Midwesterners in Paris, further away than most, I would say, or thought we would be. But you've had this career where I'd argue technology is always fueling the evolution of how culture shows up in daily life. From Beastie Boys to Winamp to Beats Music to Apple to LVMH, technology becomes this distribution for culture. The medium changes, but not the need for technology to change how we use it as we become a more global world with the internet. And so I'd love to kind of hear a bit more about you and how you sort of came to be with us today.
Well, I think I'm just got lucky. I was a kid who loved music, and I guess loved culture because along with music comes all kinds of other things, from horror comics to horror movies, I guess, and skateboarding. And I think one thing that's important in my story is that I was always a lover of niche culture. So I grew up in a small town in Indiana where we didn't even have a record store, yet I loved these things that were impossible to get even when you drove an hour to the record store. So what I had to do was to go near Notre Dame, the university, and buy a copy of Maximum Rock and Roll, and then take it home and mail order to get what I wanted. So that was in the 80s. So in 1990, 91, when I got to university and I got online, this is pre-web, but there were internet communities then that are really in so many ways no different from Reddit or Discord today. But that was where I met people who liked the same music as me for the first time. So the internet to me was really just this place to kind of get what I wanted, which I wasn't finding around me. And then I think that led me to a whole bunch of opportunities. I mean, I studied computer science in the early 90s, and it was really very difficult to stay in grad school in the mid 90s because there were so many jobs that you could get outside of the university. But I was lucky and just sort of fell into this slipstream of digital music from the very beginning, when it was science fiction, all the way through to the iPhone. Now, what I became inadvertently with that was a student of how the internet is changing culture. And I suppose more broadly maybe how technology changes culture, because you're always looking for patterns, and you're looking for the pattern. First it's like, is this similar to the pattern I saw last year? And then now that I'm older, it's okay, how is what we're seeing in crypto similar to what we saw in the evolution of the internet? But then it encourages you to read more, and especially being part of the music business, I was always struck by the fact that we pretended like the music business had been around forever, but really it had only been around for a few decades. So we always kind of wanted to go back to when things were better, but then you gain some perspective and realize, well, wait a minute, none of these things are divine. These are all just industries that were created by people who came not too long before us, and maybe change is actually the constant. So I think that that's how I ended up here, was loving culture, loving music, loving skateboarding, and studying computer science, and then just being lucky enough to put those two things together. The way I look at it, we're all crazy in our own way, and I've been really lucky in that the way that I'm crazy is valuable to someone. I love culture, I love technology, and I've managed to sort of put those things together and into a career, which, I mean, I never even had any aspirations of having a career, to be honest. But I thankfully I have passions, and those passions have intersected with something that has become at least somewhat professional.
I mean, we've kind of joked before about, like, you don't believe in religion, but you do believe in music. And maybe you just actually are a product of scarcity, right? Like, within music, there are genres, and people could call some genres niche or small, but that actually could still be millions of people that are excited by a topic or by an item. And so it's almost as if your career has brought you to respect and understand that the amalgamation of things that are deemed small is actually larger than the sum of parts that most people recognize. And so therefore you're sort of primed to understand and adopt what could a digital asset be, right? Like how could you take music and go from the way you think about the collection of music to the introduction of digital assets?
I think there's definitely something to that. I think I've been super lucky in that, if I was somebody who loved mass culture, I think the internet would have been like, totally scary, right? I
Yeah.
knew a lot of those people, as the music business was going from a $30 billion industry to a $15 billion industry. They just wanted it to go back to the days of, the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears. And that was never my goal. My goal was not, my goal was actually to, have people who love things that are niche, have a more perfect marketplace in a way. And I think there is something really interesting in what you're saying about scarcity being some sort of inadvertent theme, because, I've always said that, I remember when I saw Steve Caballero, who's a skateboarder, wear a Misfits t-shirt. I think it took me 2 years after that to find an actual Misfits album, and not for lack of looking, but I think it's hard to imagine those days, right? When the entire world isn't at your fingertips, when you didn't like just ask a question and immediately pick up your phone and type it into Google or YouTube or whatever and find the answer, right? You actually had to go record store to record store asking people, for these sorts of things. Now come all the way full circle on Discogs.com. Oh, and by the way, the Misfits were a very unpopular band. That's why they were so hard to find. They were not a mass market product by any means in the 80s. Which is also, but now I was in Las Vegas a few weeks ago and I saw the Misfits skull on the Sunset Strip because I think they were playing a Halloween show at some casino. And a couple of years ago on Discogs, the most expensive album sold that year was a Misfits 7-inch that had sold for more than $10,000. Right. So that notion of, again, the way that I frame, what I've lived through is the internet is this revolution of information, where information went from being locked behind gatekeepers, whether that was FM radio or cable television or newspapers or magazine companies. There were media gatekeepers, and unless you owned some spectrum, you didn't get access to talk to people. Right. To that being completely unlocked. Like that's what the internet did fundamentally. Anyone can go register a domain and go, I can be as big as Yahoo. Right. That's what the internet, was all about. Now I think that we're into a separate revolution, and that's a revolution of value. And I think you're right. There's something about that combination of, growing up wanting, scarce information for scarce goods that like sort of puts you in a position to understand, first, a revolution of information, which ultimately leads to 6.5 billion smartphones on the planet, right? So you have 6.5 billion people who have, powerful computers with high-speed internet connections in their pockets. And that creates like this, this network of connectivity where information can travel, but also value can travel. Right. And I think that's where we've landed. We're now, and I a couple of years ago, certainly during the pandemic, but even a bit before, I started to realize that we were spending a lot of our time and attention in these borderless online worlds, yet we are, voting for our governments in these, sort of fundamentally geographic political regimes, right? So the idea of democracy is you draw a line around some people on the earth, and then you get the people, inside of that circle or whatever shape it is to elect somebody who represents their ideals. And, I started to realize that, that was increasingly difficult. Go back to Elkhart County, Indiana, which is, as rich are rich and poor are poor and more diversity ethnically than it did when I was growing up. But also we spend our time and attention in these parallel universes, in this borderless world, the one you and I are in right now, the one we're talking in right now. We're not in the same physical location, yet we are collaborating. And, of course, those worlds are going to have their own economies, right? So we'll have not only the ability to, to interact in the way that we're doing right now, over TCP/IP, but we're also going to have the ability to transfer value over this, and that will be outside of, kind of the government system. It'll be a digital system.
I think you're hitting on a really important point there, because the revolution of information came about, and before that, everything that you learned, that you knew as true, that you discovered was completely told to you, right? Experimentation and exploration was a small fracture of what you could actually expect from life. And then when you actually got the internet, we had to adapt to it, and therefore hardware had to adapt to it, which meant that the utility adapted around it as well. And suddenly individuals had the ability to have a different form of information than someone sitting next to you, right? You could look at your feed and see a completely different world around you than I could in mine. And so we have this fracture, which you've talked a lot about in sort of how we see ourselves as tribes. And I think it's important to explain that a little bit, because it's also important to explain, well, like, what could value mean? Like, to your point, in a borderless world, it could mean that, we are interested in a DAO or an NFT project that gives us value over something that we find interesting. But it could also mean in the future that the way that we tie the value of our identity and our history is also separate from that physical place, because now we've revolutionized information. And so therefore, in this next phase, like, how should someone listening actually contextualize that today?
I see an evolution that starts with Bitcoin and digital money, and evolves to digital collectibles, and then I would say digital utilities such as tickets and memberships, and then I would say digital products like that digital replacement for the wristwatch, and then ultimately we have digital passports, right? I mean, ultimately your government document is it's a digital document, and the way that you move borders is you prove that you are the owner of the wallet that contains that document. And not only that, but you can kind of federate the access to the information that's within that document, right? If you are 22 years old and you go to a bar in Los Angeles, they take your driver's license from you and they run it through a little machine, which pulls way too much information about you personally, more information than it needs to. The only thing you need to do is prove that you are of age to get into that club. They don't need your personal information. And that's the kind of thing you'll be able to do with digital identity in the future. And I think these things are inevitable. But if we live in a world where digital assets are an important part of our life, then we must have digital security, right? Because if my wealth, if my individuality, if my belongings, and ultimately my identity are represented by scarce digital goods, right? If the future of identity is ownership, then I must have security around that ownership, and I can't have hacks at scale. By the way, the present of identity is ownership. During COVID, I could go to the US and I could come back to Paris, unlike many, many, many people, because I owned two pieces of identification. I had a US passport and I had a French work permit, right? And the ownership of those two documents allowed me to move those borders. Now, the technology behind those two documents was not great on a relative basis. And in the future will be better.
And I think you just very clearly described the different types of value that we should be looking at as we think about this mind shift, right? Because it's not actually behavior shift. The behavior shift is already there. It's the technology catching up. And so before we kind of go into this next piece, I think you bring back the really important aspect of why hardware matters in this and why hardware matters around the security of these types of value. So as we start to go into Ledger Stax and what this brings to this revolution of value, can you describe Stax a little bit for those who are listening and don't know about it yet?
Sure. And actually, let me just pause on like why hardware matters. In technology, there's no such thing as software without hardware, right? So, I think oftentimes in crypto, we talk about like hardware wallets versus software wallets. But the fact is software wallets run on hardware. So we should really like just focus on the hardware that those software wallets run on. And the reality is that if you don't have a secure element and you don't have a secure display, then you don't have security, period. So it's not about software wallet versus hardware wallet. It's about the, I mean, look, your phone is running an operating system and your ledger is running an operating system. The question is, do you have security within all of these elements, within, within the chip, within, the path from the chip to the inputs and outputs, and then inside of the operating system that this is running on? Do you have security? That's really the question to be asked. So, for Ledger, the focus has always been security and self-custody, and security has always been by design, right? The assumption is that everything that can be hacked will be hacked, and that reward dictates how much someone is willing to spend on an attack, right? So if you have a centralized resource that's hosting billions in assets, then you can afford to spend a lot to exploit that resource, right? So you're always looking for by design, and you're looking for ways that you can, first of all, decentralize, so that if one node in the network is attacked, it doesn't attack everyone in the network. And also you're looking for that resiliency to be anticipated up front, right? Assume that the attack is coming. You can't put a door behind 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 a door and just say that's secure, because it's going to be very hard to get through. Because if the prize behind all of those doors is big enough, someone will get through all the doors. So you have to ask, what are the other ways that you can mitigate an attack? And in the case of crypto, it's actually beautiful, because your value is secured by the network, right? And that is the beauty of the blockchain. So, you go, okay, well, great. I don't have to protect my value. I do have to protect, my key, which shows I am the owner of that value. Okay, well, we've already massively simplified the challenge, right? Because I don't have to protect all the gold bars. I just have to protect the proof that those gold bars are mine. I can assume the gold bars are safe, but I have to protect the proof that I am the owner of many of those gold bars. So, the design of Ledger has always been in this way, right? How can you do two main and incredibly crucial things? One, protect your private keys from being exposed or stolen, and two, how do I know that when I'm signing a transaction, I know what it is I'm signing? Knowing that to do that, you must have a secure display that your computer and your phone don't have. So again, this isn't about hardware versus software, because your computer and your phone are hardware, right? This is about, about doing crucial things, with a secure display, and about keeping crucial assets, namely your private keys, offline. So this is what Ledger's been doing for 7 years, and it started with the Nano S, Nano X, which added Bluetooth, now Nano S Plus, which is basically the X minus the Bluetooth. So we basically took the same architecture as the X, the same chip as the X, with one added benefit, that it's got a more developer friendly features. The same screen as the X. So the S Plus is really this, fantastic device, which for $80 gives you the world's best security. But I would say that the X and the S have one big shortfall, and that is, the screen is small, and there's another which is, not fatal, but maybe unfortunate, I would say, and that is that they have the form factor of a USB stick, which is quite convenient. I am known for wearing mine around my neck, and it works. It works very well. But the problem is that there's this mental hurdle that people have to get over with crypto, which is, and what they think is, oh, USB stick, I know what that is. You put stuff in it, so that must be the place where I put my digital value. Then it sort of becomes this blocker for people understanding how crypto works, because they think, oh, my crypto lives in that device. And then they think, oh my God, if I lose that device, I'm screwed. And now they've just got the wrong mental model for the whole thing, which is, no, your crypto is not in that device. This is a device which keeps your private keys offline and shows you what you see is what you sign at the moment of signing, but actually your value is safe on the blockchain. But, I think that, the form factor of the S and the X are great. I love them. I wear them around my neck. I loved seeing it around Gunna's neck on the Met Ball. All credit to Ari on that one. It's another story we can tell another time. But really like that people want a bigger screen and a better form factor, right?
But you hit on an important note that I think before we move on, we should just reemphasize for people, which is that the network itself is secure. The hardware is not. And to your point, software is built on hardware. So if you have hardware that is inherently insecure, you moving to this new space, all of your value, it will never be okay unless you actually choose secure hardware. And because we come from an era where infrastructure was built on top of banking systems, which were centralized, most people have never had to think about that before. So in order to engage in the distributed network, where your digital life has value and you deserve to own that value, you have to understand hardware. And this is the first time I would say Ledger's had. I mean, the Ledger devices are beautiful, but now we have a sexy device.
That's exactly right. I mean, the revelation that I had that led me to be here at Ledger today was back in 2018, and I was lucky that I was personal friends with Pascal Gauthier, so that I was able to sort of think hard enough about this to have this revelation. Because what we're talking about right now is the thing that hit me like a ton of bricks in 2018 when I went, oh my God, like this company actually could be one of the big important companies of the next 20 years. And my thinking was, wow, digital assets are going to be this revolution. And it's a revolution that's akin to the internet, and it's actually separate from the internet. So I really don't like the term Web3 because it makes it seem like it's incremental to Web2, but it's not. It's like, if you think about the technological revolutions of the last couple hundred years, from industrialization to automotive to the silicon chip, certainly the internet. And I believe that, digital assets are a revolution that is on par with each of those. It's not a part of the internet revolution. It's actually its own separate revolution. Okay, so, and I think that the net result of that, as we just talked about, is that the digital assets play an important and kind of inextricable role in our lives. I mean, I think this is another thing that people really have a hard time with. We like to think that we're these sovereign creatures and technology is this thing and we're in control of it. It's not true, right? The fact that your local water treatment facility probably runs on Windows 95 puts you and your family at risk, right? Like we can't separate ourselves from technology, and you experience that all the time just by the hassle of like dealing with, your phone company or whatever it is you have to deal with. And you realize that actually unplugging, is incredibly difficult. And I think that this also just defies people's logic in so many ways. I mean, I remember in 2000 when people thought, the .com thing is over, and the internet's for geeks and this is never going to be a big part of life. But now, it's almost like the people who are hustling are the people who use the internet the most, right? I mean, if you're riding a bike for Deliveroo here in Paris, you're not a wealthy person. And you need your cell phone more than almost anyone else in the city, right? So this isn't, technology isn't something that is just a luxury, right? It's not. It is a necessity for, for existing in the society that we've built. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but but I don't think you can deny it, and I think people really try to. They have a discomfort with it. They reject it and they deny it, and it keeps them from seeing how new technologies will also become this inextricable part of our lives. I mean, I suppose you could file your taxes in the US if you didn't have an internet connection, but I think that it would be a lot harder than, if you did. I think that, the technology becomes, the way you make an appointment at the doctor, the way you make an appointment at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Like, this isn't like some fringe, thing. I think so. So, now when you think about, okay, digital assets are going to become that embedded in our lives, right? They're going to become that important to us. Okay. That was where I went, hold on a second. If that's the case, then the devices that we are using today are not the devices of the future, period, right? And now, like, look back again, people think like, oh, but by the way, I remember people thinking, oh, no one will ever unseat MySpace, right? Or, and oh, Facebook is unassailable, right? Now, kids will tell you Facebook is for grandparents. They've never heard of MySpace, right? These things have a way of going away. So if, in 2002, I would have told you that, the future kind of mobile revolution was going to be driven by the people who just made this MP3 player that came on the market, you would have laughed at me and you would have said, come on, Ian, like Microsoft obviously has this on lock, or maybe Nokia, right? You never would have, people forget, like, memory is fiction, right? So there are very few people who either remember or would admit that they doubted Apple in 2002, but it was a $10 stock. They had less than less than 2% market share. But there was this path from the iPod to the iPhone that was revolutionary, and Microsoft trying to condense a personal computer and Windows into a phone was a massive failure. And I think you would have been hard pressed to find the people that would have picked the right horse in that race. So this is the context for me when I go, wait a minute. I think digital assets are a huge part of the future of humanity. I think that it's not even an opinion, it's a fact. The devices that we have on our desks and in our pockets cannot protect digital assets, period. Right? So, okay, now, which horse are you going to bet on? Are you going to bet on, a secure device that has to become more full featured to become that secure digital asset device of the future? Or are you going to bet on, the massive, it does absolutely everything device somehow becoming more secure? So that's, that's, I think, the importance, right? I still haven't gotten to Stax or the beauty of it. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think it's important to double click on that fact that, if memory is sort of this failure, the reality too is humans don't like to go backwards. And so to your point, like Ledger isn't here to decide what's good or bad. There's just an undeniable reality of what's coming and what exists around us. And as secure hardware with this uncompromising security, you actually made the bet to focus on ease of use, right? More people will do this. And so therefore, how do we make it easier? Because to your point, prohibitive language, a tough device, something that looks weird, something that makes you feel like it intuitively isn't doing what the device actually serves the purpose of. That's hard for people to absorb. So I think that is a really good way to think about, like, okay, but what does Stax change in this process?
Yeah, that's a great transition. So again, 2018 was when I had that realization, but I didn't come to Ledger until 2021. And when I did come to Ledger, Pascal gave me the title of Chief Experience Officer. His idea, not mine, by the way. And so when he said it, I had to go, oh, okay, wait, is that really a title? What does that mean? But it was such a brilliant premonition in my view, and a real challenge for me, by the way. It's not
Why?
a title I've had in the past. But basically what he was saying was, Ian, when you buy a piece of Apple hardware, you're not buying a piece of Apple hardware. You're buying the Apple experience. You're buying into the Apple experience. You're buying into the Apple ecosystem is what you're doing. You're buying into a world of blue bubbles, not green bubbles, right? That's what you're doing when you buy that piece of Apple hardware. And, Pascal recognized that, he has, the right direction in terms of, the North Star for the company: security, self-custody, digital assets. These, this is a gigantic opportunity. But if we're going to be the ones, who build this, if we're going to be the Apple of this space and not the BlackBerry or Nokia of this space, it has to be an experience and not just a piece of hardware, not just a piece of technology. And so then you go, okay, well, how do we do that? Where are the real challenges here?
Mm-hmm.
And also, what are the ones that you break off first, right? Because you can't solve everything at once from a challenge perspective. Okay, so with from our perspective, we're looking at, okay, where are the experience challenges? I think, and many people will tell you like, oh, Web3 is hard to use, but I always say, wait, stop. What do you mean specifically, right? Because oftentimes people just don't know. They're just repeating what someone else said. But really, I think there are two very key challenges in kind of usability for a new person coming into the space. One is onboarding, and onboarding is a challenge not only because you've got to if you really want to do it right, you have to set up a device, and you have to write down these 24 words. And that takes time. So there's a user experience issue there, but there's also just a conceptual and mental load issue there. I mean, if writing down and securely storing your 24 words doesn't freak you out, you don't understand it, right? And so getting people over that initial mental hurdle of what self-custody is and means is I think step one. And that's something we're working on every day. So with Stax, we've massively improved the onboarding user interface itself. I've done it with Stax many times now, both a new device and a restored device. And I love how much easier it is than what we've experienced in the past. I can get through the initial onboarding in 60 seconds, and I think 2 minutes to do a restore, which is a huge step up. It doesn't solve the mental hurdle necessarily, right? Or the cognitive load, but ease of use wise, that's much better. And we have much more coming on that. It's a big focus for us for 2023. The second, real usability challenge is the connectivity to Web3. And that's what we're trying to attack with Ledger Connect, but also with our partnerships with many people, whether that's, Coinbase Wallet, MetaMask, Temple, or Trust Wallet, et cetera. All of that really matters. Like making connectivity to Web3 super easy to use, and that's why again we're trying to set the standard for both security and ease of use with Ledger Connect. At the same time, partnering with other wallets on getting that right. Now, from a look and feel perspective, with the device itself, you ultimately want to get something that is something that people want and people understand. In the podcast with Tony Fadell, which I really encourage people to listen to, because he does a much better job explaining why he was thinking about the form factor. But I've learned so much from Tony, just generally in life, in work, everything else. But what's amazing to hear him talk about the design of this device is that he was looking for, analogies. He's like, okay, this thing can't look like a USB stick. It also can't look and feel like a phone, but we know we like kind of phone screen form factors. And, we know that when we're thinking about value, credit cards make sense to us. There's a space in our brain for these little cards of value. And he went all the way to the analogy of this kind of like stack of cash with the band around it. Right. And it's so amazing to hear him say it, because you can just see he put all this stuff in the hopper, and out came, Ledger Stax, which is, I would have never got there. Like, that's why it's so amazing to me, just so if you see, I can understand the inputs, and my output would not have been the same, but his brain went there, like, kind of automatically. But I think that in doing so, what he's done with Ledger Stax is he's created something that does represent exactly what it is we're trying to be, which is it's this secure companion to your existing device, right? So on one hand you go, oh my God, we're headed toward a future where digital assets are valuable, and the devices that we have don't handle digital assets. This is going to be a disaster. And then you go, oh wait a minute, well, for anyone can walk into a Best Buy and for $80 make their $1,200 phone secure. Okay, well, who wouldn't do that, right? So I think with Ledger Stax, what you're doing is you're adding just this this form factor that makes a lot of sense to people, that's easy to onboard, that's easy to personalize, that makes it something that I want to have in my life, that doesn't feel overly geeky, that actually feels like it does what I need it to do, which it adds security to my already digital life.
Well, and to your exact point about Pascal sort of giving you this mantle and saying, okay, what are the first pieces of experience that I'm going to go after? You actually said with Tony, I'm going to go after the experience itself. I'm going to give a reason if I can make this URL experience IRL to make it sexy and fun and compatible and actually something that, respects this world that only, as your point from earlier, you are the only person that knows your own algorithm. And so now you have this new way to actually show your world to others that nothing else describes or displays other than Stax. And that's why I think the e-ink is so important as well for Ledger Stax, because it lets you get to use it, not just something that you have to charge every day, but it's actually meant to serve a real purpose with longevity in your life.
So with Ledger, we're trying to build this experience, and the experience includes the hardware, but then it comes all the way through to the way that you use the hardware. So, first of all, I'd like to reiterate what Tony said in the podcast that, Ledger Stax is a V1, right? And, I remember that there were, eight versions of the iPod, and we're on to iPhone 14 or wherever we are right now, right? So, with Ledger Stax, like let's imagine that there's a long roadmap and a long future here, and there'll be many evolutions. Also remember that when the iPod came out, there was no iTunes for Windows, and Windows was 98% of the market. There was no iTunes Store. There was no iTunes Video. There was so much yet to come. And I think, again, our memories, forget that. And we imagine, sort of the iPod as it was 5 years in, as opposed to the way it was day one. So again, let's make that leap and say that Ledger Stax is that V1, and there's a lot of evolution to come, and imagine what that is. This is also why, the operating system is so important, right? Because, I think what you do in hardware is you make hardware, you make an operating system so that people can build on it. That builds an ecosystem. So that builds an ecosystem of services and applications that grows the market. And now you've got a bigger audience, and you've got to rev the hardware. You have to have that operating system that built, where so people can build on top of it. That grows, applications and services. That grows the market, and now you do it all again. So that's sort of, I see it as not just a flywheel and not just a circle, but really a spiral, because it's getting bigger and bigger, as it grows, but you do keep needing to refresh the hardware, continue to develop the operating system, continue to develop the ecosystem of people that are developing on that, including yourselves. So we're not the only ones developing on that. It's it takes a village, and much more than that. And then that's what grows, and then you keep going. From that point. So I think that's the important thing to consider here, is that, there is this sort of, this ecosystem around the hardware, that's incredibly important. So from our perspective, when we're looking at it, again, think about iTunes relative to the iPod, think about the Nest app relative to the Nest device. Without the software component of it, the device can't succeed. And that's the part that I really want to emphasize, because we spend a lot of time talking about Ledger Stax. We talk about this beautiful screen. We talk about the e-ink. Incredible, right? Now, Ledger Live, Ledger Connect, these are incredibly important. The fact that you can buy crypto, and have it go, straight to your Ledger Stax, or straight into self-custody, protected by Ledger Stax, is incredibly important. The fact that I can swap from, a stable coin to Ethereum or Bitcoin, et cetera, and back again, all from self-custody, super important. The fact that I can stake and earn yield, all from self-custody, very important. The fact that we're trying to build, an ecosystem where you can securely, mint, sell, trade NFTs, incredibly important, right? We've had, huge amounts of transaction volume on sites like OpenSea thus far, and really no one's ever done it securely, meaning with hardware, with clear signing. That's a huge opportunity, yet to come. And then there are services that we need to build on top of this, such as seed phrase backup and recovery, to make onboarding, much simpler for people. So, again, yes, Ledger Stax is a beautiful device, and I hope that it is the iPod of this space. That's my sincere hope. But I think for it to be, it has to have iTunes, right? There has to be Ledger Live, Ledger Connect. There also has to be a developer platform, with an active, developer audience. And then you have to have this array of services around it, like what's possible with Ledger Live: buy, sell, swap, stake, lend, credit card. You have to have this NFT ecosystem around that is secured by Ledger Connect, that is has best practices driven by things like Ledger Market, et cetera. And then you have to have services for the customer that don't yet exist, that we need to build. So I think that really to understand fully what it is, not just that we're trying to do, but what really needs to be done for this space to be successful, you have to look at that. I also think that leads you to sort of why Ledger Stax, right? Versus something else, because you go, okay, well, look, first of all, if you don't have a secure display, forget it. And I don't care if it's your phone, it's your device, anything. If there's not a secure display, it's not secure. Just like stop. There's no, that's not a objective argument that I'm willing to have with anybody. And second, you have to have a secure element in terms of the chip inside the device. And third, there better be an operating system, right? Because if there's not an operating system, then there's not an array of services that's going to grow with us and it's going to end up in a place that we couldn't even predict, right? And this is not just about crypto. This is about security. And this is about, secure applications. I can't wait to use my Ledger Stax for FIDO2 to have truly secure login, to sites across the internet, as an example of something that has zero crypto, relationship to it, but it is secure. And I do need security, which is beyond what my phone provides, to log into, the most secure pieces of my digital life. Right. So yeah, I think that we need to be thinking about what is that, entire secure ecosystem around the Ledger Stax.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to double click on that fact that we truly do just live a life of one, and actually having your Ledger Stacks, like you can fully actualize that in a way where you can live a one and you could have 10 different ones a day, right? Like we were joking at the office for programming for Ledger Open, which will have just happened when this comes out, and someone wrote on their spine for their stacks, their kid's name and put like college fund. Like that's what that Stax is for. And it's really this playful element. And if in the 2000s, if in this previous world that already feels so far away, the internet brought us this revolution of information, which changed how we connect. It brought us to this place of one, right? Like we individually are the scarcity and our experience is that scarcity. And so now it changes how we trade and measure that value forever. And so, if it's happening right now, what should people be aware of as they step into this world, as their experience? Like how would you, if they've just gotten a Ledger Stax, what do you recommend for them to immerse themselves if they're new?
So just somebody who's a newcomer to crypto generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remind, when you said earlier, like we already have over 5 million people who use Ledger devices as they currently stand. And so we're about to have millions more come on board for Ledger Stax, which is creating this new experience. So how does the Ledger experience overall help them as they come into this world?
Well, what we're trying to do is to create, a place for them to connect with whichever services are useful and interesting to them. I think for anyone coming into the space, the first thing I'd recommend they do is participate in Ledger Quest in some way and familiarize themselves with Ledger Academy. In this space, knowledge is power, period. And the, it's also, it protects you, right? I would actually recommend people spend time on education before they come into the space. Even if before you bought a ledger, you spent 6 months learning, I think you're in a great, in a better place. You want to, I've known people that, that's actually their first step is I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to buy anything. I'm going to spend zero money, but I'm going to deep dive on the learning. And, so I'd say that's actually a great idea. So, I would first start with learning. That's why we have Ledger Academy. That's why we have Ledger Quest. The other thing I would say is join communities of like-minded people, whatever that is for you. I'm a member of, 90s Kids, which is a bunch of skateboarders, and shit, I'm more of an 80s kid than a 90s kid, but, at least, it's a community of like-minded people. That one is probably not for you, but find one that is for you. Or I always recommend that people, if you're interested in kind of the cultural or the artistic side of this, look at, collecting on a chain like Tezos. So, join the Discord of object.com, join the Discord of FX Hash, and just lurk. See what people are doing, see what people are talking about, see what people are buying, see what, sparks your interest. I mean, you could, put $50 worth of Tezos to work over 6 months and, actually, not win or lose too much, but become a member of a community, become, familiar with artists and kind of get to know this world. I think that's, a much better way to enter than, taking a lot of risk, taking a lot of, doing something that is, maybe not smart. But I think if you're in the space, and you're watching what's going on, then you'll start to get a feel for it, and you'll make friends. You'll be a part of communities, and I think in that way, you're more a part of the future. Than somebody who is, reading about Bored Apes in the Wall Street Journal and then thinking they know what's going on. I promise you, those people absolutely do not. You just, you're just sort of a part of this, like, surface level zeitgeist, as opposed to being a part of a community, which is, which is really focused on something, that's deep, niche, moving, active, liquid, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because sometimes it sounds so corny, but actually one of the takeaways from all of this is actually that you have to lean into like embracing yourself and having fun with it around it. And, as we kind of get closer to closing this out, like, I think it's really important, like, remind people who are listening, like, why actually is ownership and its relation to crypto so revolutionary right now?
What we're always doing is you're always building on the past, right? So we've just been through a revolution of information, which has onboarded billions of people into networked lives. We layered on top of that this pandemic, which not only had kind of these unprecedented economic stimuluses in the traditional world, but also pushed us into spending more and more time in digital worlds, working, and learning, etc. Our kids went to school on Zoom. Our meetings, became much more comfortable. Everyone of every age became much more comfortable working with people who were not in the same physical space with them. I mean, even when I started work at Apple, they had almost zero culture. The people who invented FaceTime had zero culture of remote meetings, right? And now they've spent years with not being, in their new offices. So we have, as humanity, learned to collaborate with people we are not in the same physical space with, which is, for me, the actual definition of the word metaverse. The definition of the word metaverse does not contain the word 3D. But it is about people who are not in the same physical space together, collaborating with one another. Okay, so that to me is why digital value is so important. It's not because digital value alone is important. It's because you're putting this technological revolution of digital value on top of a networked society, right? And therefore, you'll get that build over the next 15 years, just like we had, with the internet, where things went from being, exciting and overblown and .com bubble to more practical and realistic and, built kind of one foot in front of the other. And then, you get very real use cases. Again, for me, I think the best thing to do is to assume that 15 years from now, your government document is a digital document, and the way that you move borders is to prove you're the owner of the wallet that contains that document. If you just take that as an assumption and now work backward from there, you see all kinds of things that happen. I love and if you want to take a less serious example, I love the example of concert tickets, which, when I was a kid, If my mom took me to see, Kiss or AC/DC, which she did, thank you, Mom. I
Go,
would take
Mom.
those tickets and, put them on my cork board because like that was a big deal in my life, to do that. Now, through the internet, what did the internet give us? A shit ton of advertising. That's what. And so what have our concert tickets become? Another form of advertising. So you print out this concert ticket. You and I went with Tony last night to see The Cure. And what did we have? We had printed tickets that the top half was a ticket. The bottom half is an advertisement. And then I don't know about you, but I saved my backstage pass and I threw my ticket in the garbage, right?
100%.
But in the future, that ticket will be collectible again. And there will be this, and 20 years from now, we will be like, yeah, remember that night we went with Tony to see The Cure and here's the proof, and so I think these things are very, it's like, this is, as Clayton Christensen said, there are no new human problems. We just hire new technologies to solve old problems. So, that putting my ticket on my cork board, it had meaning for me as a kid. Imagine, if today I had an NFT for every concert t-shirt I've ever owned. Imagine if I had an NFT for every skateboard I've ever owned. They wouldn't all have the same value, but certainly that one that was the one that I got for Christmas at that age that changed my life, like that would have special meaning for me. And it's not even that it would have special value. This isn't about, a Bored Ape going from $0 to $250,000 in value. That's not what this is about. That concert ticket on my corkboard did not have resale value, but it had a lot of value to me personally because it's proof of life. It's proof that I existed. It's proof that I experienced. And so I think that, in these digital lives that we live, we of course we will have they'll have their own economies. Of course they'll have their own collectibles. Of course they'll have their own products. Of course they'll have their own identification, ways of showing that we're individuals, ways of sharing, right? Ways of combining one thing into another, like what Moonbirds is doing right now, saying that if in addition to a Moonbird, you have these other things in your wallet, your Moonbird can now become something else. These are like, very, very cool things. And like, they fit a lot of, things that we've done, previous in life. I mean, the way that kids alter clothes and sell them on Depop, like this is not, it might be fringe behavior, but to the point from our very first part of our conversation, like all behavior is fringe behavior, right? There is no such thing as everybody. There never was. Mass media made us believe that there was a left and a right, for so long. And really what you had was a left and a right and a lot of unrepresented voices. And so now, Discord in so many ways represents humanity, way better than, NBC, ABC, and CBS ever did.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, you're hitting on this exact piece, which is that emotions don't change, boundaries change. And in the mass scale of humanization where we are these one of one, your individualism and actually having ownership over that is the most important choice you could make today. And so it's essential that as you do that, you educate yourself, you understand the change that's coming, you tell your friends around you, and you hopefully use Ledger Stax as your gateway for this next era because there is no going backwards. And what is coming is actually incredibly exciting and actually validating for more human behavior as it is today versus the human behavior we project through outdated societal norms. Ian, thank you. I am so excited at everything we've been working on. It's been going on much longer than I've been here, but today is a really special day with the launch of Stax, with Ledger Stax, and thank you for telling your story and why it matters.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And really, Ari, thank you for everything that you do. We got to do one of these with you. And I want to talk about how somebody who has, no background but is not a former CMO has come to be the head of communications and marketing at Ledger, and how we do what we do. Because I think, honestly, I think we're building something new and different here.
We're
we're not building, Like you and I always say, I don't want to build the future with the past. So, but that's hard to do. We're trying to build something new.
Well, until next time, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
I'll
thank
talk to you later.
All right, talk to you in a bit.
This content is provided for informational purposes only and is the sole expression of our opinion and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. Do your own research. Any loss or profit is your sole responsibility. Stay safe.